Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to the Terra podcast. I'm Tom Patton. As we wrap up 2024, we're taking a look back at some of the most viewed episodes of the Terra podcast from the past year. It's been an exciting year in space commerce, and we've chatted with some very innovative companies that are doing some very interesting things across all verticals of the industry. We're starting the top 3 most viewed episodes not with a company, but an organization. Florida is one of the epicenters of space commerce, with more launches from the state than anywhere else in the world. In 2006, 3 of Florida's existing state space agencies were combined to form Space Florida as a public corporation and innovation connector. In April, we talked with Space Florida CEO Rob Long about the agency's mission and the economic impact of the industry in the state.
We're the state's aerospace financing and development authority. So what that really means is we endeavor to work with aerospace companies, and the definition of aerospace is pretty broad. But we work with aerospace companies in a partnering arrangement that endeavors to bring them here to the state to help them grow. And we do that through various tools, largely through financial tools that we have at our disposal. To ultimately lower the cost of capital, the cost of moving and growing here into the state of Florida. And that's, kind of something that we've developed over time and really provides a pretty nice benefit to a company when they're really trying to grow. And obviously we the state and the areas where they grow into then reap the economic benefits from that. So that's one side of our business. The other side is what we call our spaceport authority. And that sounds and it is very similar to some of the other port authority roles that you might see out there in an airport or a seaport. We do it for a spaceport, and it's something that we are definitely growing, and we work very closely with partners at NASA and the United States Space Force here at Cape Canaveral to help build out the infrastructure necessary to ensure that the spaceport here can support the capacity of launches that are required to meet the demand signal from that side of the industry as well. So, those are our 2 main lines of business. But ultimately, we also are very much involved across the spectrum, whether it's workforce, all the enabling functions that are necessary for a business to grow and to thrive in Florida. We want to make sure that we're there to come alongside them and support them really, in 3 main areas. We like to say that, we have an unmatched financial toolkit, which I mentioned earlier. Obviously, we have an unbeatable location. There's number one, there's more launches to space happen here at Cape Canaveral than anywhere else in the country. And usually most places in the world can't compete with us. And that's obviously just here at Cape Canaveral, but really our purview spans the entire state, and there's opportunities across the entire state. And we do that with an expertise here in Space Florida that I would argue is second to none.
Now, you're a government agency. Talk about your relationship a little bit with the Florida legislature and kind of how that whole process works.
Yeah, Space Florida is a very unique organization overall. We are a public corporation that is chartered in statute by the Florida legislature. We actually are not in a traditional state agency, if you will. We have a little bit different arrangement. We have our independent board of directors that I report to as a CEO. They help guide us strategically as we go after the mission of increasing aerospace economic growth here in the state. We are under contract with the Department of Commerce, however, so we have a wonderful partnership with the Florida Department of Commerce and helping, mutually to grow the economy here in the state. And then we also have a great partnership with the Florida Department of Transportation. And then, as you may know, that space is actually an official mode of transportation here in the state of Florida, and it's we're the only state that actually recognizes that as such. And in doing so, that created a program with the Florida Department of Transportation where we partner on investments in infrastructure for spaceports. And so it's a great partnership. Spaceport is a unique organization that there is nothing else like it in structure across the country, and it's been pretty powerful to date.
What types of products and services then does Space Florida offer to aerospace companies?
Our main, I guess you would say, service in terms of helping companies grow or expand here into the state of Florida, move here to the state of Florida, I would say is largely centered around some of the financial tools that we have at our disposal. We do something that's called conduit financing, where we act as a party that comes alongside a company if they need to finance, let's say, a facility to grow or something like that, in which we then help them go to the market and act as somewhat of an intermediary in that role. And then because we are a public corporation and we act as a governmental body in some regards, we also have access to certain exemptions and things like that, that depending on the situation can apply. So really the goal for all of that, though, on the financial side is to reduce the cost of capital for these companies. So we can stack the benefits, whether that's certain tax programs, whether that's funding from that might come through, let's say, what we call the Spaceport Improvement Program, which is the Florida Department of Transportation program that we partner on. There are other programs and things in the state. So as you start to stack those financial benefits, that reduces the overall cost of capital, which can be very powerful. And it's also just not some quick cash and a ribbon cutting, right? It is actually something that we partner and we endeavor always to enter into a long-term strategic partnership with these companies. And we see that over time recently really coming to fruition, where we'll partner with a company who is, let's say, builds a new building or a new headquarters here in the state of Florida. And then when they want to expand, they come right back to us, and then we work through that with them. And so they're continuing to build on those relationships. So that's probably, I would say, one of the main areas in terms of our toolkit that is important. But like I said, we also have the spaceport line of business, and that really is really intended to look at the infrastructure that's needed to operate launch complex, if that's something that is beneficial to the community. But really, I like to say that we're really acting as a partner with whether it's federal agencies, whether that's local groups, in order to make sure that the space transportation infrastructure here in the state of Florida is second to none. I mean, the economic impact is really one of the key metrics that we look at to make sure that, when we want to say we provide value back to the state, that's one of them. And if you look at the life, about the first 10 or so years of Space Florida's existence, we had about a $6 billion economic impact, which is a great number. And it's pretty inspiring when you think about the numbers of jobs and the amount of not just direct jobs, but the induced jobs that come along with companies moving and growing into the state of Florida. But on top of that, when you look ahead, we're forecasting, about another $1 billion a year in investment in the coming years. So, when I mentioned that project pipeline, that's not slowing down right now. And so we're really trying, but $1 billion a year is obviously great, and we want to increase that over time. And so that's kind of our intention going forward.
Rob Long is the CEO of Space Florida. People of a certain age in our audience will remember the days when via satellite was an indication of the highest level of technology when it came to communications. Now, chances are if you're communicating, it's somehow via satellite. There are major advances being made into satellite communications, and one of the companies that is at the forefront of those developments is Cesium Astro, which recently unveiled its Element integrated phased array satellite. On the podcast, company founder Shey Sabripour explained how a phased array satellite works.
A phased array is a device that's been around. It's a technology that's been around for a long, long time. I think ultimately it was sort of conceived and conceptualized and invented well over 100 years ago. But ultimately it was used in radar applications since 60, 70 years ago. It is a device that allows you to electronically steer these beams that I talked about. Let me explain what a beam is in a layman's term.
Sure.
A beam in telecommunication, kind of like your cell towers, what the cell towers are doing, the antennas that you have seen on these cell towers, these sort of rectangular white antennas that you see on cell towers, they're illuminating projecting a beam. You can think of it as a beam of light. It's not light, it's radio frequency. It's a different frequency than light, but it's essentially electromagnetic waves or photons, if you will, either one. This illuminating area, which is typically a circle or an oval shape, allows you to have a set of frequencies that your cell phones, for example, work from. And you drive through one beam, and then you drive through another beam, and then you drive through another beam. And the reason for this is that we can reuse the frequencies that are allotted to cellular infrastructure over and over again and provide more and more service. So as we've gone from first generation cellular technology to fifth generation 5G, we have made modifications, many, many modifications to better provide faster service to more and more people, okay? Sure. But for the longest time, these beams, whether they were on satellites, as I mentioned, or on cell towers, were fixed beam technologies. So these beams within which you can connect your radio, your cell phone can connect to a cell tower, or your radio station or your home can connect to a satellite, are fixed. They're looking at a fixed point and the beams are fixed. But as you go closer to Earth, for example, in satellite communication, the satellites are moving faster. They orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. And so you can't have a dish on your car, on your roof that you're constantly, or with a motor drive, you can, but the motor will wear out and you can't constantly track these satellites. So a better technology for that is a phased array where the antenna can remain stationary and fixed, but the beams electronically, without any moving parts, track the satellite, you see? So, and then the opposite way in cellular technology, as we go towards 5G and 6G, some of these phased array technologies are also being used where the beams can move and provide more dynamic, more agile service to areas where there's more demand. They can provide more power, shape the beam, and provide a more agile service to dynamically change the service pattern. So for example, the fixed beam technologies, if they're just pointing somewhere and there's just not as many people in that beam, you're sort of wasting that beam. Whereas if the other beam has a lot of people in it, you get congested. So what you want to do is you want to have these agile beams to dynamically steer. That's what phased arrays do. They just electronically steer the beams, but they provide many other applications. As I said, you can dynamically change the frequency per beam, which is important. With it's too detailed to get into the details of it. You can dynamically adjust the power to each beam, and you can. And in military applications, there's lots and lots of benefits with phased arrays that come from this multi-user, electronically steerable, dynamic, software-defined beams.
One of the largest concerns for satellite operators is security. Sabripour said that there are multiple ways for the industry to protect their spacecraft from bad actors.
Security comes in multiple forms. One, obviously, is traditional technologies, not traditional, sorry, but advanced technologies in cybersecurity to be able to have the proper encryption such that satellites cannot be commanded by the bad actors or get access to the satellite internal information or its operation in orbit, its attitude, its other attributes of a satellite. The other part of it is spoofing a satellite or jamming a satellite. And that's an area where phased arrays are really effective. This is one of the reasons that also why I wanted to build a complete phased array satellite. Phased arrays allow you to really provide some anti-jam technology that, again, the details of which are beyond the scope of this talk, but phased arrays provide. This is what I've just talked about, all the agile frequency assignment to any beam, channelization, sub-channelization of frequencies within a beam, processing within the beam, adjusting the power for each beam, and then the subject of anti-jam, anti-spoof is just a few examples of I like to call tens, if not 100, features of phased array technology that are very, very important, and that's why I believe the future belongs to this kind of technology.
Sabripour said the company hopes to launch the first Element satellite on a SpaceX rideshare mission in October 2025. Coming up, shielding critical components against radiation in space, and a look ahead to what we think will be some of the biggest stories to follow in 2025 as we wrap up our 2024 year in review. But take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Xterra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Well, everything that travels into space is subject to radiation. Here on Earth, our magnetic field protects us from some of the most dangerous radiation that blasts our planet every day. But you don't have to get very far off the ground, relatively speaking, to have to be concerned about protection from radiation, both for people and for critical spacecraft components. Merek Chertkow is founder and CEO of the Radiation Team, a company specializing in mitigating the impacts and risks of ionizing radiation throughout the development lifecycle of space systems.
It's not so much that radiation work itself is hard. It's that it's tricky. And we'll probably get into this later. I could deep dive on this forever. At the end of the day, it's reliability. It's making a system survive being in outer space. And for those that don't know, reliability is always kind of the last thing that's put on a program or the first thing that's cut. The obvious example is we're here to make a flight computer survive in outer space. But if a customer doesn't have a flight computer, or it's not designed yet, or they're going through major trades, you can't start analyzing a component or a circuit until somebody has decided what components or circuits are going to go in that system. Otherwise, you're just churning forever. So some big institutions have this problem where they say, we want to do this mission. And then they say, okay, what is the requirements? Let's go find a bunch of parts that work for that system, and then let's start designing the system. And if you do it in that kind of serial effort, it'll go really, really slow. So the challenge is allowing design engineers to start designing their systems and working on the reliability at the same time, and then hopefully converging at the right time. But if there's any change, it can cause a lot of negative work. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is understanding what you really need. When a customer or a program says, I want a 5-year lunar base or thing or space station or whatever that does this, you're like, well, what does 5 years mean? Does it mean you have to survive 5 years exactly and then you can fail on the next day? Or do you have 30% reliability, 50% reliability? You can tune a bunch of knobs and spend a lot of time deciding what's good enough for a system. And some customers have those lines really, really strict. Like the big defense contractors, it's pretty clear what you have to go do, and there's a lot of margin. But for a lot of the small, young space startups, they're willing to take a lot more risk, but they just haven't, or they don't know how to decide what risk means in terms of insurance policies or business models or schedule or cost. So figuring out all these things and saying, when are we going to make an engineering design decision is a very tricky thing. It's much more than just radiation work. It's programmatic work. It's systems work, mission operations work. And so I can dig into a lot of those if a lot of that doesn't make sense, but it's a holistic approach in order to do necessary and sufficient engineering.
But it sounds like everything is pretty much ad hoc. I mean, it seems like every system that you work on kind of requires its own parameters.
That's true. That's definitely true. On that front, we have customers who say, how do we work with you? And we say, well, what do you need? Do you need testing? We can do turnkey testing. Do you need mission reliability? We can do that. Do you need support against, or not against, but with your customers and what they're asking for? So everybody has different needs. It's a little less that it's ad hoc, and it's more like the field is so broad. Identifying what is the best approach to take for a customer or for a mission is part of the challenge. Sometimes it's work at a circuit level. Sometimes it's at a box level, like a flight computer. Other times it's at the system level with fault tolerance or mission design. And so it's helping the customer understand what goals they have, which is mission success. And then it's understanding what's the path of least resistance and the best approach to take in order to get them what they need. And there's many knobs to turn, and there's schedule constraints and cost constraints. Some customers have both or none or one or the other. And so it's figuring out what they need best so that we can best support their needs.
But then how does testing for radiation in space work without actually being in space?
There's a lot to that I want to talk about, which comes down to like, how do you know what you're testing on the ground is right to be representative of space? We can get into that if you want, but at the end of the day, there's two primary types of testing. There's single event effects testing and then dose testing. And there's other subcategories, but it comes down to knowing what type of random stochastic processes you're going to see in space against radiation effects. That's SEE testing, single event effect. And then the other one is dose, which is more of a long-term degradation. And it can happen on electronic systems or materials like glass darkening and so on and so forth. So my community uses facilities that we rent. There's heavy ion facilities, which we use to test for galactic cosmic rays. Basically, when stars explode and they go supernova, they scatter all the periodic table of elements throughout the universe. And so there's actually like these charged ballistic missiles that are just flying everywhere in the background. They're well shielded from Earth's magnetic shield, or at least they're bent and funneled up towards the poles. But we need to test against those environments, and we do that at heavy ion facilities. These are hundreds of millions of dollars. These facilities cost to build, so nobody has their own. We rent them from national labs, and there's about 4 of them in the United States that are quite common. So everyone in my field is struggling to go get that time. And at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. You take a piece of electronic hardware, ideally like an IC or FET or some type of smaller component. And for those that don't know, basically, it's the thing that looks like a cityscape on your motherboard on your PC. So it's all the components in electronic systems. We bias them, we power them, we put them in a functional state that is hopefully representative of flight, and there might be multiple states. And then you set them up and you hook up a data acquisition system and power and whatever else you need, and you basically turn them on. And then you request the beam, and there's a bunch of different ions and species that you can choose to hit it with, and you choose those carefully so that they represent what you're trying to do in space. The longer you are in space, the more likely you are to see a rare particle that you otherwise wouldn't see. And so you choose the beam, and then you expose it, and you watch what happens. And you're either watching for a non-destructive event, like a bit flip in a memory of 1 to a 0, or a destructive event or a transient if it's an analog device, and you see how this device responds. Depending on the technology of the device, which I won't go into, but all different devices are made of different materials and have different structures, you can expect them to have different responses. And you can sometimes expect them to break or not break, or have what we call a latch up, or have a functional interrupt where they stop working and they can come back with a power cycle. So we kind of go in with a high level plan on what to expect. We take our data, and then we're done. And but a test can usually easily take a full day. Sometimes it can take multiple days of testing to test a range of parts. And then you collect your data and you write reports, and you go back and you say, all right, here's how this device responds. And for your mission, you can either expect it to have a destructive effect or not, or here's the effects that it does have. And you can either use a different part if that's not acceptable, or at the circuit level, you can do a design that mitigates that problem so that the customer can use it, or they can just accept the risk. And so it's about a feedback loop of saying, all right, customer, what are you trying to build? What is that system composed of? We break it down, we test those things, we see how they respond, and we feedback and say, this does or doesn't work in the system. And you just kind of repeat that cycle. So it's kind of like walking and looking under a bunch of rocks. And if everything breaks, then you got to go back and redesign everything. And so the implied thing here is you want to do what's highest priority for a system. If it has a core piece of technology that everything else is built around, you want to test that thing, because if that thing's not good, everything else has to change, as opposed to some very common piece of electronic. If that fails, even if it's critical, there's maybe 10 or 50 other components that you could choose from and swap that in. So testing isn't just as blind as saying, oh, well, let's just test this stuff. You have to test it in context for how you're going to converge towards a good solution in your system.
Merek Chertkow is the founder and CEO of the Radiation Team. So what's on the horizon as we approach 2025? Well, no matter how you feel about the outcome of the presidential election, there are some big changes likely coming to agencies that are important to space commerce. And that begins with the nomination of Jared Isaacman as the new administrator of NASA. If confirmed, Isaacman will be the first NASA administrator to come out of the commercial space industry. That could represent a significant shift in the agency's focus. In our view, over the past few years, NASA has been as much an earth sciences organization as it has a space exploration agency. It will be interesting to watch how or if those priorities change with Isaacman at the helm. He will also inherit the Artemis program that is years behind schedule and woefully over budget. Isaacman is an entrepreneur, and he may focus more on running NASA as a business to the extent that he can. But given his 2 commercial space flights, it's a sure bet that he's enthusiastic about the possibilities for human space travel. Talking about NASA brings us to DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. What will be the dynamic between Isaacman and Musk in particular, as both of Isaacman's space flights have been aboard SpaceX Dragon capsules? We can't know, of course, until Isaacman is confirmed, but from our vantage point, that seems pretty likely. Another story to follow as it pertains to NASA and DOGE is efficiency. NASA's processes have come under close scrutiny from the GAO, as well as its own Inspector General, with much of the focus being on cost overruns, contracts, and staffing. With Musk leading DOGE, what recommendations might be made to make NASA more efficient? If one of the recommendations is the replacement of the SLS system with something more affordable, and we're thinking about Orion, Falcon Heavy, and Starship, this will undoubtedly bring political repercussions on Capitol Hill, as well as accusations of favoritism and patronage aimed at Elon Musk in particular. Even if this is the right course of action to pursue, it would likely ignite a firestorm in the Washington political sphere, particularly with entrenched defense industry contractors. Another development is that current FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker has announced that he plans to step down on Inauguration Day to make way for a Trump appointee who has yet to be named. That new administrator will be faced with the rapidly changing space environment, an increased cadence of launches and reentries, and likely multiple new technologies that will need to be certified. There's also the issue of the January 1st, 2025 expiration of the moratorium on new regulations regarding human spaceflight. Language included in the reconciliation bill for the National Defense Authorization Act would extend that learning period through the end of 2028. The FAA has until now objected to the extensions, saying that commercial spaceflight needs to be more closely regulated. But will that be the case under the second Trump administration? The trend would seem to be towards fewer regulations, but it remains to be seen if that will be the case with commercial spaceflight. And with Elon Musk already involved and Jeff Bezos making overtures to the incoming administration, it would not be surprising to see the extension of the moratorium embraced by the new administrator. The FCC will also have a new chairman, who will be faced with a growing number of satellites that will require radio spectrum to carry out their missions. On the private side of things, one of the main stories will certainly be the ongoing testing of the SpaceX Starship system. In 2025, we feel like we will see the system complete a fully orbital test flight and recovery of both the booster and Starship itself. Additionally, the demonstration of orbital refueling by Starship is a critical milestone on our journey back to the moon, and that should be conducted sometime in late 2025. It's also fairly likely that Blue Origin will successfully begin orbital operations with its New Glenn booster. Will that lead to competition for SpaceX and human orbital spaceflight? It's probably a pretty fair bet that Jeff Bezos has that in his sights. And if New Glenn's booster reaches its potential and reusability, it will certainly give the industry another option for lower cost to orbit for heavier payloads. We'll also be watching Boeing's work on the Starliner system. Boeing still insists that it will be ferrying astronauts to the International Space Station, though when that might happen is an open question. Meanwhile, Sierra Space is waiting in the wings like an understudy for the opportunity to have the Dream Chaser human-rated. Interestingly, this may be one of the sleeper stories of the year. If its initial cargo flights go well, look for an accelerated push to bring on a new manned version of Dream Chaser to replace the ailing Starliner. And none of this even begins to touch on what developments might come in the realms of satellite communications, Earth observation, navigation, or so many other things rising out of the commercial space industry worldwide. We hope you'll continue to be here with us as we chronicle, cajole, and critique, when necessary, the new space industry. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Xterra podcast. Check out our YouTube channel and be sure to click on subscribe so you can stay up to date on developments in space commerce and be notified when we post new videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XterraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Happy New Year, and thanks for joining us.